This is an ABC7 News special, Project 1619, First African Landing.
Oh, this is where it happened, this is where it all began, this is where our story began.
It's a moment in history that is significant for the 1619 arrival of my ancestors.
It's a complete moment of truth. This piece of history has to be shared because it hadn't been in the past.
We're so happy to know that we're getting an opportunity to present it to the country.
Years of the first Africans landing here at Fort Monroe. Let's make them proud.
Hello and welcome to this ABC7 News special on the 400th anniversary of the first African landing. I'm Sam Ford reporting from Hampton, Virginia. Now, the story of those first Africans who came here was almost by chance. You had enslaved Angolans headed to Mexico, stolen, and then they ended up stepping off here at Point Comfort, which is now the Fort Monroe National Park. In August, Virginia and the nation recognized the solemn anniversary that paved the way for what became slavery in the United States. We came here to witness the ceremonies, commemorations, and performances to honor those 20 and odd Negroes who stepped ashore so many years ago. For many, the weekend began at sunrise, a windy morning on Hampton's Buckrow Beach, a ceremony to reconnect to the ancestors who arrived in this same area 400 years ago.
Just took a moment of silence and just felt the feeling of, you know, this is where it happened, this is where it all began, this is where our story began.
The theme, Celebrating Africa. Dozens wore African dress, parades with many African drummers that for many created a spiritual connection.
You get the healing from it. You actually find out whatever negative energy that you had, you can release it, you know, through the drums.
Think it's in your DNA?
Hey, know it.
It was also a weekend of reconciliation of sorts with black voters for Virginia's Governor Ralph Northam, who'd received bad publicity over wearing blackface at some point in the past. He took pictures with constituents and expressed views on the black past and present.
Bringing to light the evolution of that history, which started with slavery, and then we had Jim Crow and massive resistance. Now we have massive incarceration, and it's just been this evolution of black oppression, and we really need to focus on that. We need to tell the truth.
At the Fort Monroe Museum, Colonial Secretary John Rolfe's 1619 letter to England marking the arrival of the 20 and odd enslaved Africans in a passing reference, a phrase that would hold so much significance 400 years later. Chief organizer of the weekend is executive director of the Federal 1619 Commission.
The contributions of African Americans are the story we want to tell in bright, bold ways so that all of America understands that we have been through this journey in ways that are important for us to recognize, the good, the bad, and the ugly.
We've been working toward this event for 25 years, and our goal at that time was to make it to the 400th anniversary. So today is a culmination of a lot of different people coming together to make this work.
Another major part of the weekend, the music, from gospel to choir performances to the hip-hop of rapper Common. This concert for the first American landing was free. A complaint among some people, the weekend did not get enough publicity to fill Hampton's hotels, but those who learned came from places like St. Louis.
Once in a lifetime, momentous occasion that I felt very compelled that we had to be here.
And Atlanta.
I came here specifically to pay my respects to the 20 Africans or so that came here. I saw this on the internet and what was going on this weekend and knew I needed to be here.
For years, the history was that the Africans landed in Jamestown until the people here in Hampton, 40 miles down the James River, said, and we can prove it. So Jamestown sent the marker down here, where it stands on the Fort Monroe waterfront. So what about those 20 and odd? This marker noting the first Africans in Virginia was a popular attraction during the weekend. It used to be in Jamestown until this man, Calvin Pearson, through old documents learned the truth 37 years ago.
And I told Jamestown that your narrative is wrong, and Jamestown said, no, you don't know what you're talking about. So then it took me another 17 years to convince people that I was telling the right story.
Eventually, Jamestown, that had invested a lot in the first African story, relented.
They said, well, we knew you were telling the story all along, but we did not want to give up our version of history because Jamestown is based on tourism.
To Pearson and many other historians, the location is important. But all those years ago, those enslaved Africans were likely only concerned about one thing: survival. Captured in Angola and put on a Spanish ship to Mexico, and just before their arrival to Veracruz, two English pirate ships, the White Lion and Treasure, flying Dutch and Italian flags, fired on them, overpowering the Spanish galleon with the Africans inside.
They were looking for gold, and they found slaves. So in order to realize some type of profit, they took 60 of those Africans. They split them 30 and 30.
Historian K.I. Knight wrote in her book, Unveil the 20 and Odd, the English headed for the nearest English port, Virginia. But
when they rounded the coast of Florida, they hit a hurricane. That hurricane busted up the Treasure. It was called Windblown and Torn. Now, the other ship, the White Lion, was actually blown off course.
When they made it to what's now Hampton, Knight says much of Colonial Secretary John Rolfe's report, the Dutch man of war, is written so King James would not find out about the piracy, which was strictly forbidden.
The captain, the owners of the ship, they were all susceptible to basically losing their head, like Sir Walter Raleigh had a year before.
Once their journey was over, the Africans were deemed indentured servants, and their hard work turned the colony around, eventually paying off their debts.
Those Africans grew crops and raised livestock that kept this settlement alive.
We also found out that a lot of these Africans, once they gained their freedom, they started their own plantations, and they started hiring black servants and white servants. And once they gained their freedom, they started marrying white women and Indians.
But Virginia legislative bodies worked to deny them any rights, and soon blacks were slaves for life.
The English wanted to keep them in their control because without them, the settlement made no profit.
Knight, who is also a genealogist, says DNA links millions of present-day Americans, herself included, to those 20 and odd. When we come back, a Hampton family that traces its roots back to that first African landing. That's next.
I'm so glad that we're here and we're commemorating. This is not a celebration. It's a commemoration. It's a sacred honor of ritual to these Africans and their descendants.
Among the 20 and odd who came ashore 400 years ago were two named Antony and Isabella. And there is a family in Hampton today who say those are their ancestors. Their ceremony, using songs in African languages, launched the 1619 weekend. Hundreds came. Randall Tucker even played the drums.
And it's not just us, this is American history. This is history that has to be told, and we have to keep it alive.
The Tuckers believe they descend from Antony and Isabella from Angola, who came on that first ship. Historical records show their son, William Tucker, whom they named after their English master, was born in 1624, baptized the first black child born in the colony. They said this was also a family reunion.
Because all of the family will be showing up just about, that we haven't seen in a long time.
They said a cousin buried here, Thelma Williams, researched the links and made the connection. Wanda Tucker, a university professor in Arizona, just returned from a visit to Angola on the eve of this event. She said when the Angolans learned the story,
I was welcomed home everywhere I went, I was welcomed home. I danced with the music and with the Angolans, and we ate together, we danced together.
The event brought out much of official Virginia. Lieutenant Governor Justin Fairfax, Congressman Bobby Scott. Are Anthony, Isabella, William buried here? This William Tucker is a retired New York City police officer.
And it's a known and unknown because there are a lot of unknown markers here that we don't even know who's there. We did a sonogram of the cemetery a couple of years ago, and it's over about 150 unmarked graves. You can see the cross. That's where we have the cross indicating that there are family members all around here.
As one family member told us, in the past they often didn't put up markers. They planted trees by the graves to mark the spots. The current president of the Tucker clan says he gets upset with some these days who question the legitimacy of other Americans here 400 years.
Let the naysayers know that you tried to get rid of us after you used us up, but we're still here. We're more powerful than ever, and we're not going anywhere.
A 400th anniversary is important, and the federal, Virginia, and city of Hampton governments all launched efforts. They said not to celebrate, but to commemorate what happened here. The biggest single event of the weekend was the gathering under tents at Fort Monroe when Virginia luminaries from its governor, 2 U.S. senators, and many others saluted the 400 years since the first African landing. But the speaker, who seemed to capture the heart and spirit of the event, had to be preceded by a box so he could reach the microphone.
My name is Bryson Dildy.
A middle school student from Virginia Beach who came to the organizers' attention after he got over 500 people to send cards to his middle school teacher when he learned she had cancer. Here, he quoted Maya Angelou with the message, "Be kind."
She said, "People may not remember what you say or do, but they never forget how you make them feel."
And what he does know,
well, in my 11 years of being on this earth,
we couldn't hear the rest.
Imagine the problems that would be solved if all people were kind and felt cared for. It doesn't matter what your race or religion may be. We all deserve kindness.
He challenged the audience.
And as we commemorate 400 years of the first Africans landing here, I challenge you to let today also be a celebration of your commitment to become a more caring and kind individual.
With that, he was off. Hugs from the other speakers, a wave to an audience, a message they will remember. Next, we're going to talk about the significance of this 500-year-old oak tree and its importance in African American history. That's coming up.
It witnessed the first American Indians in this space. It witnessed the first Africans landing here in 1619. It witnessed the building of the largest stone fort in America that was built by Africans right here. And then it witnessed the contraband decision.
Expressing how grateful I am that they could survive such, inhumane treatment, and still yet over time we're here, we're prospering, we're doing well, and that's because they survived and thrived.
I didn't want my son to be in the world thinking that we are just a part of Maryland, Virginia, or South Carolina. Our history extends across the sea.
So many people believe that we started in enslavement, but I've been able to prove some of my ancestors that were here in 1622 who were servants.
We wanted to show respect, to come for the cleansing, just to be in the moment, to be with our brothers and sisters and share in this moment.
The cleansing ceremony was fantastic. The water is not cold. It was salty, and they spoke wisdom, words of wisdom to me in reference to being free from my own personal chains.
Just took a moment of silence and just felt the feeling of, this is where it happened, this is where it all began, this is where our story began.
And to be here by this water,
let me get a picture.
it just brings me back. And when they said to me, they hugged me and said, "Welcome home," it just meant so much. It just meant so much.
We're on the grounds of Fort Monroe, no longer an Army base, but a national park. And a symbol of this fort is this tree. They call it the witness tree, 500 years old. It witnessed the beginning of slavery 400 years ago, as well as slavery's end during the Civil War. It stood the test of time, watching history unfold.
It witnessed the first American Indians in this space. It witnessed the first Africans landing here in 1619. It witnessed the building of the largest stone fort in America that was built by Africans right here. And then it witnessed the contraband decision.
The contraband decision was made during the Civil War, a powerful moment in history portrayed in the Fort Monroe Museum. Union General Benjamin Butler in command when 3 enslaved black men stole a boat and came to the fort seeking freedom. When their white Southern masters came demanding their return, Butler said if he returned them, their work would help the Southern war effort. So no, they were contraband of war. Soon more Virginia slaves fled their white masters for Fort Monroe. Current Virginia Governor Ralph Northam quoted historians about the decision.
The greatest moment in American history.
President Abraham Lincoln later used that same logic with the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring free only those slaves in the states fighting against the United States. And nearly 150 years later, the tree witnessed another piece of history.
The first black president making it a national monument.
That was November 1st, 2011.
Fort Monroe also became a refuge for slaves that were escaping from the South and helped create the environment in which Abraham Lincoln was able to sign that document up there, the Emancipation Proclamation. In September, Fort Monroe closed its doors as a military base.
And Superintendent Terry Brown says the tree has witnessed one more thing.
And just to add the cherry on top is witnessing the first black superintendent. So it's really special to be able to connect all those dots all the way back to August 1619.
As a footnote, this tree also witnessed Confederate President Jefferson Davis being imprisoned here at Fort Monroe after the South lost the war. And just before the 400th anniversary, the governor of Virginia asked for this arch to Davis, put up in the 50s, to be removed. They removed Davis's name.
To have a monument glorifying a person who worked to maintain slavery on the same site on which enslaved Africans both first arrived here and were later freed is not just inappropriate, it is offensive and it is wrong.
So how did the rest of the country participate in this important anniversary? Well, we'll tell you next.
When we do this, we feel the spirit of our ancestors, and we know they're pleased with us because we're telling their story. We're not telling his story, we're telling their story.
So far, all the activities involving the first Africans have taken place here in Hampton. And the organizers wanted to do something so that people outside this area could participate, and they came up with the idea of the bells. On the final afternoon, they handed out bells, 500 of them, some engraved with the words, "A Day of Healing." Also a larger bell to ring at 3 p.m. The idea to ring bells for 4 minutes for each century that has passed since the African landing. Remember the song, "My Country, 'Tis of Thee, Sweet Land of Liberty, Let Freedom Ring"? Though it did not ring for decades for some of the 20 and odd, nor for centuries for hundreds of thousands of Africans brought to this land in bondage, they rang the bells to wrap up that weekend of reflection.
When we do this, we feel the spirit of our ancestors, and we know they're pleased with us because we're telling their story. We're not telling his story, we're telling their story.
We've come a long way, and then in other ways we haven't. The way I look at the 400 years is this: 400 years of the African history of this country, of Virginia, was the Virginia legislature that created the legal architecture of slavery for the entire nation.
I think it's fantastic. Our people need to learn where we came from so we can move forward.
Fantastic. I can feel my ancestors. I can feel their presence.
We have to tell the right story, especially to our children. I'm a father, and I have children that I want to make sure that they understand the contributions of African Americans to the building of this country.
America is a great country, and a great country remembers its history, and it brings in all the complexities of it.
As they rang the bells at Fort Monroe that Sunday afternoon, bells rang in other places, like Mother Emanuel AME Church in Charleston, the National Cathedral in Washington. As we close, we want to remember the complex, storied history of this country and those that made it what it is today. We'd like to thank you for joining us for this ABC 7 News special commemorating the 400th anniversary of the first African landing. I'm Sam Ford.
Imagine the problems that would be solved if all people were kind and felt cared for. It doesn't matter what your race or religion may be. We all deserve kindness.